This video shows how to define imports in XLReporting. We will take you through the main steps: the Define menu, the top section, which shows the general settings of this import, the mapping of the fields in your source data to the columns in your dataset, a preview of the data as it would be converted and imported into your dataset if you run this, and finally we have the Save button and the Actions menu. Now, talking through the general settings, the group determines where this import will be shown in the menu. The target data is the type of import you want to run. We'll explain that separately later on. Second, you select which dataset you want to move data into. Next, you select the source data. For this example, we are using an Excel file, but the principle of the mapping and the definitions are the same whether it's a connector or an API or a file. So what we're doing here is overwriting the account data with the contents of the file. Thirdly, you select the user roles, which determines which users have permission to access and run this import. And lastly, we have the import batch. An import batch enables you to connect multiple imports into one single job. For this video, we're going to overwrite the dataset called account data with the contents of an Excel file. So let me take you through the steps. First, let's select the file. This is an Excel file, and you can see that this is the column layout in that file. These are the names of the columns. You can decide if your files column headers or just column references. In this case, we're using column headers. So this is a preview of the data in your file. Click Apply. Then you see the standard mapping. So the first row are the names of the columns in your dataset. The second row is the fields in your source file. So you can start to map those. So for example, the first column, if I click on mapping, you see that in the dataset column called code, we're going to move the contents of the field GL code in the file. You can choose all the fields that exist in your file. So we do the same thing for account name, that's mapped to account description. Of course, you could map it to something else. You can map it to anything you want, basically. So here in this step, you choose which field in your source goes into which column in your target data set. Secondly, you can decide if you need to convert some data. For example, let's take the amount column. Let's look at the mapping. What we see is that we have two columns in our source file, a debit amount and a credit amount, but we just want the net amount in the dataset. So what you can do is actually start to create a formula. The formula will simply be debit minus credit. You can choose from the fields in your file, and you see that the amount is now being calculated. That's how you can make calculations as part of the mapping in your import. Of course, you can do all sorts of things. You can multiply it by 1,000. You can use functions. We've got separate videos on how to use functions. But if you have a scenario where you have to do an if field is such, then do so and so, this is the place where you can do that. Another example, let's imagine that we want the account name to be imported in uppercase. So let's go there. It's mapped to the account description in the file, which is fine. Go to convert the data. I'm going to find a function that's called upper, which is identical to what it is in Excel. You now see that the account names are translated into uppercase. So this is what's going to be imported. This section here shows a preview of the data that will be imported into your dataset when you actually run this import. When it comes to choosing how you want to import data, there are several options. You can either add to the existing content of a dataset. So for example, your dataset has 1,000 rows, you have a file of 100 rows. Those 100 will be added, so you'll have 1,100 rows in your dataset. You can choose to completely overwrite the content, so the dataset will be completely overwritten with the contents of your source data. And you can replace. Now replace is a special option because if you choose replace and you go to the mapping, you see an extra field on all the columns that says replace existing mapping. If you tick that, what this means is that XLReporting will see which types exist in your source data, and it will overwrite all the existing data for that type. So in this case, if your file contains BS type data, it will overwrite all the BS type data in your dataset. And all other existing data will be left intact. The last three options are special. They apply only to datasets with a key value. So these are datasets that have a unique value on every row. These three options enable you to either update a specific row, update or insert new rows with a unique value, or delete certain rows with a unique value. When you define imports in XLReporting, you may sometimes want to select certain data and not import all data in your data source. So we're going to show you how to do that. For this video, we're going to use an example account list, which imports from an Excel file. Now let's imagine that we don't want to import all GL codes, but only a certain range of GL codes. So what you would do is go to mapping. You map the column to the relevant column in the dataset, obviously. Then you start to selection. And for example, on the account code, you may want to only select items that are larger than, say, 20,000. And what you see in the preview is that a filter is taking immediate effect. This is a preview of the data that's being imported. So in this example, you will not import all data, but only the data where the code is larger than 20,000. Now, you can take that further. You could add another filter, for example, on this one, where you would say that the value has to be, say, margin. And you see that the preview now shows only accounts over 20,000, where the class is margin. So that is how you add selections to an import. You can also create more complex selections using functions. So for example, let's imagine you don't want to select just margin, but you want to select multiple values. There are filter functions. One of those is any, which enables you to select multiple values. So for example, margin and expenses. So we're going to select either margin or expenses, and as you see, that is taking effect immediately in the preview. So using the functions, you can create complex selections of import data.